Welcome everyone to another installment of Philosopher Meets Critics, an event organized by the Federal University of Bahia and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. Today we are happy to have with us Professor Jennifer Lackey. Jennifer is a professor of philosophy from Northwestern University, and she has a new book entitled The Epistemology of Groups, published by Oxford University Press. You can find more information about Jennifer's book at the description below. So welcome, Jennifer, and join us today. We have three critics discussing Jennifer's book. So welcome Federico Penelas from University of Buenos Aires. Welcome to Adam Carter from University of Glasgow. And welcome Deborah Tollefsen from University of Memphis. It's great to have you all here. Once again, I would like to thank you all the participants for accepting the invitation to join this session. We will first start with a short presentation by Jennifer, and after that, we will allow our critics to give their comments. Without further ado, I would like to invite Jennifer Lackey to start the session telling us about the main ideas of the book, The Epistemology of Groups. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together, and to the critics for reading the book and for generously sharing your thoughts with me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to just give a brief overview of some of the main goals of the book, and I'm going to focus on kind of the bigger theoretical picture motivating the project and the individual chapters. So in many respects, the book starts with the fact that we hold groups responsible for their actions, and that groups' actions can have extremely significant consequences. And when you look at much of the law in the United States, it tends to swing to one side or the other in terms of the way that responsibility and blame and even praise is attributed to groups. On the one hand, you have a lot of case law where the company, the corporation, the group in question is found responsible as a collective or as a group, and no individual members will even be named by the corporation or the company. They will say things like, we regard this as a group level problem or a corporation level problem, and we're not going to disclose any information about our individual employees. And at the other end of the spectrum, you see a lot of cases. I mean, we saw this in a recent Volkswagen case where they really try to attribute it to a few bad apples. There were, 3 rogue engineers who were responsible for very, very, very significant negligence or outright deception at the level of the group. And so one of the aims of this project is to provide a framework for attributing and assessing collective responsibility. In many respects, I leave that, I flesh that out in various places explicitly in the book, but much of it is left implicit because I think that we can't really hold groups responsible for their actions without being able to properly assess whether groups have beliefs, whether they have good evidence, whether they have knowledge, whether they actually asserted something, whether they lied to us. And so in many respects, this project can be viewed as trying to provide the epistemological foundation for being able to hold collectives and groups responsible for their actions. And so in many respects, one of the things that you need to do when you work in collective epistemology is motivate an interest in it, because there are some corners of not only the philosophical world, but the broader world that just would find it very counterintuitive to attribute states like beliefs or knowing states to groups or collectives. And so, you'll find people saying that when we say things like BP lied to us or Philip Morris deceived us, these are really kind of just metaphorical ways of saying that some members of BP or some employees of Philip Morris lied to us. And so this tends to motivate fairly deflationary views. Some of the views might be outright eliminativist and say that there are just no such things as collective mental states, like beliefs, for instance. It really is just a shorthand way of picking out the beliefs of individual members. Or some people, rather than an outright eliminativist position, might have something more like a reductivist position, where saying that groups have beliefs or that they believe, kind of certain propositions really just amounts to that being reducible to certain members of the group, certain individuals believing the proposition. And so right out of the gate, one of the things that I wanted to motivate was why we should take an interest in the epistemology of groups in the first place, why we should think that something like a distinctive epistemology of groups, rather than just taking kind of straight views in epistemology that apply to individuals and then applying it to multiple individuals of a group. Why do we need to think about this in the first place? And when I first started thinking about this topic, I really was, I would say, kind of open-minded about where I might end up. But one of the arguments that really convinced me that we need, I think, a fairly robust epistemology of groups is just starting with the simple fact that I think is, to my mind, fairly undeniable, and that's that groups lie to us. And so in many respects, the project ends up kind of starting with group lies and also ending with group lies in kind of I think, a somewhat surprising way for me. So I think that, like I said, if you look at kind of court rulings, it's extremely standard for there to be rulings that just, kind of very explicitly state that corporations, companies, institutions have lied. I don't think that it's uncommon to think that it's not just merely metaphorical to say that the Bush administration lied about there being weapons of mass destruction, or that Philip Morris lied to its consumers about the dangers of cigarette smoking. And I think that once we start off from a place where we acknowledge that groups lie to us, and in fact, I think that groups lie to us rather frequently. I mean, when you think about kind of advertising companies, pharmaceutical companies, when you think about how much interaction we have with institutions, governments, I think that it's a fairly widespread phenomenon. But also the consequences of groups lying to us can be extraordinarily significant. I mean, things like that, I was just actually reading about, some of the harms of the pharmaceutical company lying about the addictive quality of opioids and how that led to, the opioid epidemic. And so it can have pretty far-reaching consequences. So I start the book in many respects with just a very simple argument, kind of premise one, groups lie. Premise two, group lies can't be understood without groups having genuine beliefs. And so therefore groups have genuine beliefs. And so I take premise one to be, fairly straightforward, given our practices, given the way that our institutions run, given the way that we hold various kinds of institutions and governments responsible. And then I look at, in later chapter of the book, kind of how we should understand the nature of lies. And I just don't think that we can make sense out of or understand what it is for an entity, a group or an individual to lie to us without attributing to them a substantive belief or the absence thereof. And so I think that kind of immediately out of the gate, in a fairly intuitive sense, we have reason for countenancing the existence of genuine group beliefs. And how we're going to understand that, I think, is of course part of the book project. But that's at least a framing device for motivating kind of coming out of the gate and embracing a fairly robust kind of epistemology of groups. And so I move on in the book to looking in the first chapter at how to understand group beliefs, which in many respects I take to be sort of a foundational question for taking a deep dive into the epistemology of groups. And as might be expected, just given some of the introductory remarks, there tend to be two broad kinds of views about what it is for a group to hold a belief. And since I won't be kind of going through a chapter by chapter run through in this brief intro, I'll just mention that this sort of division between, kind of very fairly inflationary approaches and deflationary approaches is pretty standard across the epistemology of groups literature. So we see this with respect to just about every phenomenon, group beliefs, group justified beliefs, group knowledge, group assertion, right? That there can be, that there are accounts that are more inflationary. And by that, I just mean something like the analysis says that groups are over and above, and the group phenomenon in question is importantly over and above phenomena at the individual level, or deflationary approaches that say, in some sort of important sense, the group phenomena are just reducible to or amount to or are grounded in these phenomena at the individual level. And so in the group belief literature, it became, I think in recent years, well, kind of relatively recent years, fairly standard for group belief to be understood in a fairly inflationary way, and in kind of understanding kind of this group, the group states as being kind of, again, like being able to float freely of the individual states in important ways. And many of these inflationary approaches are motivated by what I think Kay Mathiesen called in one of her papers, divergence arguments. And so divergence arguments are arguments that purport to show that a collective or a group can instantiate a state or a property, or be in a particular kind of state where no individual member of that group is in that state. So if you want to argue, for instance, on behalf of an inflationary view of group belief, then the argument would say, look, it's very easy to imagine cases where groups believe that P, where no individual member of that group believes that P. And so, you find a number of different kinds of cases like this in the literature. Some cases might be kind of compromise cases, like let's say one parent says, tells their child, you can't, kind of stay out past midnight until you're 18. The other parent believes that the child shouldn't be able to stay out past midnight until they're 16. And so the parents jointly agree that it will be 17. They come to a compromise. Neither parent actually believes that this is the appropriate age to stay out past midnight. But as a collective entity, this is the belief that they hold. So says the joint acceptance account. And in many respects, this is analyzed, and kind of this is really the result of literature that Margaret Gilbert kind of got going. Belief on this model is determined by the members of the group, or let's say operative members of the group, which might be members who have like the relevant decision-making authority, jointly accepting a proposition. And so these sorts of cases are supposed to capture some fairly intuitive cases. Like we might say that the jury believes that the defendant is not guilty, even though there might be some individual members who actually secretly believe that the defendant is guilty. But given, kind of the admissible evidence, they have to deliver the verdict of not guilty. And so these joint acceptance accounts say that we really should understand group belief in terms of individual members jointly accepting the proposition. And of course, given that joint acceptance is this sort of, kind of activity that group members can engage in, groups can be said to hold beliefs that no individual members do. And so one of the functions of chapter 1, I mean, I do like other things in that chapter, but one of the central functions of chapter 1 is to provide problems for this kind of joint acceptance account, or like kind of broadly inflationary views. I also consider some others in general. I also raise some problems for, kind of just straightforward, kind of what we might call like deflationary or reductive views. But the problem that I want to highlight today, given just the limited amount of time we have, is that I really don't think that these joint acceptance accounts of belief can adequately accommodate group lies. And so, one of the things that, kind of, and I take it as kind of a desideratum of an account of group lies, that it be able to appropriately distinguish between, let's say, a group asserting that P where it believes that P, and a group, kind of lying that P where they either believe that not P or fail to believe that P. And so one of the things that I kind of work through in the paper, in the book, is showing how on this joint acceptance model, because joint acceptance is an activity, is an action that that members of the group can voluntarily take up, they can kind of take up propositions that kind of fly in the face of what we would think is proper to attribute to them in terms of belief. So we can imagine, kind of Philip Morris, for purely kind of financial reasons or for legal reasons, practical reasons, having the operative members, kind of jointly commit to the proposition that smoking is safe. And we can imagine that they satisfy all of the other conditions of the joint acceptance account. Kind of they advertise this in all of their materials, they stand by it, they defend it whenever they are speaking, kind of as members of Philip Morris, or, on behalf of Philip Morris as a collective, kind of they defend this proposition. And yet I think that we would all feel, kind of the pull that the mere fact that Philip Morris just, kind of gets in a boardroom and kind of accepts this proposition and then proceeds to defend it. That sounds in many respects exactly like what they did. And we held them accountable for lying because we know that they had, kind of overwhelming evidence available that they knew of, that they looked at, that they reviewed, that smoking is extremely dangerous for people's health. And so, and that they did not have any, evidence to the contrary. And so, one of the things that I try to argue is that when we start from this place of wanting to hold groups responsible and wanting to hold them accountable for their actions, and we kind of, combine that with, I think, a starting position that groups lie, I think that should lead to the rejection of a fairly kind of dominant view of group or collective belief in the literature, the joint acceptance account. And I raise similar problems for other inflationary views of group belief. I then move on to other parts of the book where I raise to some extent similar and some kind of different problems. So I look at justified group belief in the next chapter. So I look at how we should understand group justification. And I raise problems for both what we might call deflationary views and inflationary views. So I kind of invite us to pay a fair bit of attention to not just to in a way the bases or the grounds or the reasons that individuals hold beliefs. And I ask us to look at, once we are thinking about a collective and we're thinking about all of the different individuals that make up a collective, and even if they all together believe that P, they might believe that P for very different reasons. And I think once we start reflecting on the fact that individuals can hold beliefs for very different reasons, it's a very easy step to go from there to thinking that groups can hold beliefs for not only different reasons, but conflicting reasons. And I think that once we see that, it raises problems for so-called deflationary views that want to say that group justifiedness is just a matter of individual justifiedness transferring up, so to speak, to the group. And so once you increase individual justifiedness, group justifiedness increases because it's just this straightforward transmission process. And one of the things I do in the book is I try to raise some problems for this kind of simple transmission model and show that it's not, kind of a straightforward claim that, as individual justifiedness increases, so too does group justifiedness. Because as individual kind of as different individuals are part of the group, their bases for belief, their reasons for believing a particular proposition can conflict and introduce defeaters. And these defeaters can not only you kind of reduce the justification, it can defeat the justification. So that as you increase individual justifiedness, actually you don't increase group justifiedness. Group justifiedness can actually be entirely defeated. So that's kind of one of the problems that I raise for the deflationary view. And then on the inflationary view of group justification, I raised some kind of similar problems that we saw that we talked about with respect to group belief, and that's that so we see joint acceptance, kind of models of group justifiedness, which say that group justification involves the joint acceptance of reasons, and the joint acceptance of those reasons then become reasons for the group. So you can again have a divergence. You can have a group justifiably believing that P, even though no individual member justifiably believes that P. And again, we can use like a jury case where they might accept certain reasons as a group, but not, kind of endorse them as individuals. But I raise a couple of problems for this approach. One of which is that I think it succumbs to what I call the there's a kind of a problematic manipulation of evidence that this allows. If the only evidence that's available to a group is evidence that is jointly accepted, then collectives or groups can jointly accept evidence that they shouldn't accept, and they can fail to jointly accept evidence that they should accept. And this allows them to manipulate evidence and to thereby manipulate their justificatory states in ways that are deeply problematic. Again, especially if we're coming from a place where our ultimate goal is to hold groups responsible. Because if we allow groups to just say, I'm just not going to accept that, we're not just as a collective, just not going to jointly accept this really compelling evidence on behalf of the very, 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 serious harms that our product could bring about, then we do not have, I think, an appropriate framework for holding groups responsible. Very quickly moving on, just in the interest of time, one of the things that I do in this book is I, endorse the positive views that I end up endorsing with respect to group belief and group justified belief, have an anchor in individual states. So it has a component where group justifiedness and group belief can't float entirely freely of the individual members having those states. So in many respects, I kind of think of my view as having like an anchor in those respects, but I also think that there are fairly robust kind of normative and evidential connections that arise at only the collective level. And so in that sense, I think that my view leaves room for fairly robust notion of epistemic agency. And so I call my positive views kind of an epistemic agent account. But when I turn in the second half of the book to thinking about assertions and lies, I endorse fairly robust inflationary views of those phenomena. And there might be an immediate question, wait, why do you have this like fairly disjointed? Why do, kind of group belief and group justification and group knowledge have this kind of anchor in the individual states, and then group lies and group assertion and these sorts of things do not? And my answer is, on my view, if you can grant someone else the authority to do things on your behalf, then I have a fairly inflationary view. So, Kirk Ludwig has this paper on proxy agency that I think is really helpful in thinking about how individuals or like small groups can serve as a proxy agent for another. And when I think about group lies and group assertion, think very much in terms of there being spokespersons. Nothing that like kind of has to be like, kind of in a legal document, but there being spokespersons that represent a larger group. And so I understand these phenomena in terms of at least one dimension of these phenomena. I don't think that this is exhaustive, but as sort of authority-based versions of group assertion and group lies. And on these models, a group can assert that P or can lie that P when there is an authorized spokesperson who is speaking on behalf of the group. and then satisfies, kind of the requisite kind of individual conditions for lying and assertion. But because these spokespersons need not, kind of themselves satisfy the conditions for assertion or lying, it's a fairly inflationary, it ends up being a fairly inflationary account because groups can assert or lie even though no individual member does. And I think this isn't just, you might think like, oh, well, that's kind of a minor point because there still is an individual doing the asserting or lying. It just so happens that it's not a member of the group. Like I can hire an outside spokesperson that's not a member of Northwestern and speaks on behalf of Northwestern, but that still is not really a robustly inflationary view because it still is an individual. But I actually think that's not the right way of looking at it. I think that when we look at kind of the norms or the requirements or the standards by which we assess people who assert and people who lie, it turns out that we actually don't think these individual spokespersons are doing the action in question. They're not performing the action in question. Meaning when we think about some of the requirements that we have for properly asserting, or we think about what kind of goes into lying, it turns out that none of those kind of requirements or standards apply to the spokesperson. I mean, when my chair goes to the administration and is speaking on behalf of the group, the chair should not be trying to follow the norms governing assertion, whether that's sincerity or knowledge or kind of whatever. The chair should be trying to represent the views of the group, regardless of what his or her own personal beliefs are. And to the extent that they should be trying to be sincere and should be trying to speak from knowledge, they should be doing that insofar as it tracks the views of the group. And so I think this leads to a fairly inflationary view of group action more broadly. So whenever you can kind of grant authority to someone else to do something on your behalf, then I have a fairly inflationary view. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It was excellent. So as our first critic, we have Deborah. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's delightful to be here to discuss this book. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I put in the chat a link to a handout. Are you able to access that? Okay, great, because that will allow me then just to read my comments. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. Professor Lackey has brought her philosophical prowess and analytic rigor to bear on debates within the growing subfield of collective epistemology, and as a result, produced a book which has substantially contributed to debates regarding the nature of group belief, group justified belief, and group assertion. One of the most exciting things about the book is the emphasis on the importance of these matters for issues of collective legal and moral responsibility. Today, my comments will focus primarily on Chapter 1, in which she lays out her account of group belief. Professor Lackey begins Chapter 1 by emphasizing the importance of a theory of group belief. She writes, quote, "If we do not grasp what it is for a group to hold a belief, then we cannot make sense of our widespread attributions of collective entities or actions that they perform or should have performed, and on the corresponding responsibility that they bear," end quote. I think this point is really critical. Unlike the attitudes of individual human beings whose existence is self-confirming, we know, at least in our own case, that they exist. The central evidence we have of the existence of group beliefs is our practice of attributing attitudes to groups in the course of explaining and predicting their behavior and attributing to them legal and moral responsibility. Any account of group belief, then, needs to be able to explain the connection between group beliefs and our successful practice of making sense of groups. I'll return to this point in due course. In Chapter 1, Professor Lackey criticizes two accounts of group belief, the joint acceptance account, and she focuses primarily on Remo Tuomela's version, and List and Pettit's premise-based aggregation account. I suspect most of our audience is familiar with the details of these accounts, so I'll just briefly summarize her criticisms. According to Professor Lackey, any account of group belief needs to meet the following two desideratum, and these are on the handout. The group lie desideratum. An adequate account of group belief should have the resources for distinguishing between, on the one hand, a group's asserting its belief that P, and on the other hand, paradigmatic instances of a group's lying regarding that P. The group bullshit desideratum, an adequate account of group belief, should have the resources for distinguishing between, on the one hand, a group's asserting its belief that P, and on the other hand, paradigmatic instances of a group's bullshitting that P. Consider now the Philip Morris Company on a joint acceptance account of group belief, which identifies the group's belief with state and which operative members jointly accept a certain proposition as the group's view. Philip Morris may have formed the belief that smoking is not detrimental to one's health. If this was the company's belief, then it's not possible for Philip Morris to have lied about the detrimental effects of smoking, as in order to lie, one must believe that the proposition in question, smoking is not detrimental to one's health, is false. But surely Philip Morris has lied about the detrimental effects of smoking. Likewise, it seems joint acceptance accounts have trouble explaining group bullshit, because if members of a group jointly accept a proposition with no regard to its truth or falsity, and assert that proposition, it is, on the joint acceptance account, simply an expression of group belief rather than bullshit. But according to Professor Lackey, it seems clear that groups can bullshit. She raises similar arguments against the premise-based aggregation account of group belief. Professor Lackey goes on to raise two further objections to these accounts: the judgment fragility objection and the base fragility objection. And this is also on the handout. The judgment fragility objection rests on the following principle: a group's judgment is fragile if the following holds. Were the members of the group to deliberate about the same body of evidence at T1 and T2, with no relevant difference in the information that emerges via the deliberation, and it is very likely that the group's judgments would diverge between T1 and T2. The principle is grounded in the idea that belief is a relatively stable state. As Professor Lackey puts it, quote, "We wouldn't say, for instance, that you believe I'm trustworthy if you change your mind about this question every few minutes without any corresponding changing of the relevant evidence," end quote. Professor Lackey provides an example of a history department whose beliefs about the suitability of a job candidate change without a change in relevant evidence, simply because the members want to avoid another meeting, exhibiting judgment fragility. Such fragility is, according to Professor Lackey, incompatible with group belief. The objection from base fragility rests on the idea that if operative members jointly accept a proposition for individual reasons that conflict, then the group's belief will not be properly subject to epistemic evaluation. For when new evidence arises and it's viewed in light of a set of bases, in light of one set of bases, the evidence might count against the belief. But when viewed from another set of bases, it might count in its favor. It's worth pausing here to point out, as Professor Lackey does, that many of the problems that arise for the joint acceptance account and the premise-based aggregation account do so because on these accounts, group belief is voluntary. It's under the control of the members of a group. On both the joint acceptance account and the judgment aggregation approach, operative members can form a group belief at will and can do so for reasons that are pragmatic and not responsive to epistemological factors, importantly, not responsive to the truth or to evidence. Professor Lackey points out that group belief, according to these accounts, do not have the mind-to-world fit that is paradigmatic of belief. Those familiar with debates about group belief, the debates between rejectionists and believers will find this point familiar. If group belief is voluntary, the argument goes, it becomes difficult to call it belief at all. Together, the four objections pose a formidable challenge. Since I've argued against both of these accounts of group belief in the past, I won't try to defend them here. But I would like to note that there is a joint acceptance account that may be able to avoid many of the objections Professor Lackey raises, and that's a view developed by Leo Townsend. According to Professor Townsend, a group believes that P when the group jointly commits to the truth of P. Professor Townsend uses Margaret Gilbert's notion of joint commitment rather than a joint acceptance, but arguably it's a joint acceptance view. Importantly, Professor Townsend requires that the joint commitment be to the truth of P. And this allows him to provide group belief with epistemic credentials that would give it a mind to world fit. It would also, it seems to me, be able to distinguish between group lies and group bullshit. A group lies when it jointly commits to the truth of P, but asserts that not P, and bullshits when it doesn't jointly commit to the truth of P, but asserts that P. In the past several years, new voices have contributed a variety of different accounts of group belief that would fall under the non-summative heading, and these merit further discussion in light of Professor Lackey's objections. Let me turn now to consider Professor Lackey's positive account of group belief. She calls this the group agent account. According to this account, and this is on the handout, a group G believes that P, if and only if, one, there's a significant percentage of G's operative members who believe that P, and two, are such that adding together the bases of their belief that P yields a belief set that is not substantially incoherent. I think there's a typo there. That yields a belief set that is not, it should be, substantially incoherent. This is a summative account, as it requires that a certain percentage of the operative members believe that P, but it's non-reductive or in the sense that the group belief is based in part by relations among the bases of the beliefs of the members. As Lackey puts it, where these relations arise only at the collective level and are crucial, especially insofar as the group is able to function as an agent, end quote. One thing to note about this account is that there's no requirement that the members know that a group belief exists or that the others believe that P. In that respect, this account reminds me of a version of summativism that Margaret Gilbert considers and rejects in On Social Facts. Imagine the following case, which is based on a counterexample Margaret gives in that book, though I've adjusted to fit Professor Lackey's theory. Imagine that a large percentage of the operative members of Philip Morris believe that smoking causes emphysema, but they keep this belief secret because they don't want to be perceived as not a team player or not a company man. These individual beliefs has very similar bases. As it turns out, they've all been reading, secretly maybe, the same evidence from non-company scientists. Professor Gilbert dubbed cases like this secrecy situations. According to Professor Lackey's account, Philip Morris would believe that smoking causes emphysema in the secrecy situation described above. It meets the two criteria for group belief. But secrecy situations are clearly not cases of group belief. Beliefs, both at the group level and the individual level, explain and predict action. This is the important point I highlighted above. Whatever group beliefs are, they function in a complex practice of explaining and predicting the actions of groups. One standard way of understanding how beliefs explain and predict action is to view them as causes. A secretly held belief by operative members cannot cause group action. Indeed, such beliefs would be causally inert. The group belief could not guide the individual agents in ways that coordinate their actions to bring about a joint goal, not unless they function in a collective cognitive architecture, something like a group mind, which Professor Lackey clearly rejects. The individual secretly held beliefs had by operative members might cause individuals to act in certain ways, but the group belief the state of affairs Professor Lackey identifies above remains epiphenomenal in a case where its existence is not known by its members. A secret group belief could not, even in principle then, explain group agency, and as such would not be a belief at all. Because the account of group belief that Professor Lackey offers does not rule out the secrecy situation as a case of group belief, it's an insufficient account of group belief. Professor Lackey's account of group belief violates what Professor Gilbert calls the member's knowledge principle, and that's on the handout. A group G believes that P if and only if the operative members of G know that G believes that P. Most accounts of group belief, including the non-summative accounts and the aggregation accounts that Professor Lackey dismisses, adhere to the member's knowledge principle, as they require, either implicitly or explicitly, common knowledge of the group belief. One might argue that such a principle is unacceptable because an individual person, after all, may be said to believe that P, even though she does not know that she believes that P. Here is Professor Gilbert's response to that. Quote, "It's true that we allow that someone may not easily realize that he has certain beliefs. However, in the clearest cases in which we say someone who believes something, the belief is not buried that deep. Though the question of how we access our beliefs is hardly easy, and the same goes for what a belief is, we should surely not take as our paradigm a repressed belief, or more generally a belief whose possessor does not acknowledge it given a certain amount of sincere reflection. The strict analogy with paradigm cases of the beliefs of individuals requires that the group know or could come to know of its belief," end quote. I'm not so sure we want to hold on to a strict analogy with individual belief. This may just be a case where group belief and individual belief differ. In the individual case, a suppressed belief might still play a causal role due to cognitive mechanisms that function at the subpersonal level. But unless one countenances group minds, something again Professor Lackey is unlikely to do, there are no mechanisms by which a group belief could cause group agency aside from through the minds of individual members via their attitudes about the group attitude or about the attitudes of their co-operative members. Now, Professor Lackey might add to her account a common knowledge clause, and that's my friendly amendment. Specifically, one that would require members to know that a large percentage of the operative members believe that P and that their bases do not form an incoherent set. This would seem to be an easy fix and one that would address the secrecy situation objection. But she seems to be wary of common knowledge clauses. In her account of group lies, she requires that there be a group intention to deceive and footnotes that a variety of accounts of group intention could be used here. But she specifically rules out Michael Bratman's, because it requires common knowledge. In footnote 32, she writes, quote, "Some views of group intention will be unable to accommodate most of the instances of lying discussed in this book. For instance, accounts of group intention that require common knowledge, such as Bratman's, would be at odds with the view of group lies developed here." This is an interesting concession, and I think it's somewhat problematic if her account of lying is in conflict with accounts of group intention that require common knowledge. All of the accounts she cites in a footnote as possible accounts of group intention require common knowledge, either implicitly or explicitly. Again, without that knowledge, the group intention would be inert and would not be able to guide and sustain the group's action. Unlike human intentions, which might be implicit or tacit and play a causal role without an individual being aware of it, group intentions play a causal role through their members via knowledge that the conditions for group intentions hold. Again, this is under the assumption that groups do not have minds of their own. There's much more to say here, but due to time constraints, I want to end with one last objection an objection I've raised to joint acceptance accounts in previous work. And for me, the aggregation approach is just another version of a joint acceptance account because List and Pettit require that operative members accept the view of the group that is generated by the selected aggregation procedure. Professor Lackey's account can be viewed as a token identity theory. A token group belief is identified with a set of token operative members' beliefs that do not form an incoherent set. But what happens to that group belief when, because of a change in membership, the operative members' beliefs fall below the required percentage, whatever that may be? Professor Lackey doesn't specify. In Ashes to Ashes, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Richard Kluger details the deceptive practices of Philip Morris over several decades and does so in excruciating detail. But what becomes clear from the start is the way in which the operative members of Philip Morris changed over the years as they tried to respond rapidly to rapidly developing nature of the problem that they faced. The lies, however, remained the same. If a group's belief is identical to a set of token beliefs of its members, does the group stop believing when members leave the group or are no longer operative members? Imagine a case where at T1, the operative members of Philip Morris all believe that smoking causes cancer. And at T2, the operative members all die and are replaced by new operative members who do not believe that smoking causes cancer. Did Philip Morris spontaneously stop believing at T2? If Philip Morris asserted at T1 that smoking does not cause cancer, it seems that they lied. Were they no longer lying when they asserted the same thing at T2? Professor Lackey's view is tied to operative members in a way that produces a form of judgment fragility. Recall her definition of judgment fragility. Were the group members to deliberate about the same body of evidence at T1 and T2 with no relevant difference in the information that emerges by the deliberation, it's very likely that the group's judgments would diverge between T1 and T2. Now imagine at T1, the operative members of Philip Morris believe that smoking causes cancer because they meet the conditions specified. Now imagine at T1, Philip Morris believes that smoking causes cancer because it meets the conditions specified by Lackey's account. A high percentage of the operative members believe that P and their bases do not form an incoherent set. At T2, operative members are all replaced with members who do not believe that smoking causes cancer. The CEO did this deliberately as to make sure they could not be accused of lying. And so they found people who were very skeptical of the scientific evidence that smoking causes cancer, or they were very gullible or just stupid. This, in fact, seems to be what Philip Morris and other tobacco companies did on a number of occasions as they systematically got rid of operative members who had beliefs that might conflict with the belief that smoking was harmless. The whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand comes to mind here. On Lackey's account, Philip Morris at T2 believes smoking does not cause cancer. But note that were the members at T2 to deliberate about the same body of evidence used at T1, they would likely diverge from the belief formed at T1, thus introducing a fragility that Professor Lackey says is incompatible with belief. So the beliefs are changing, but not because of evidence, just simply because they've manipulated the makeup of the operative group. Although the summative account she provides attempts to avoid the issues that result from the voluntary nature of certain theories of group belief, the selection of operative members is always under the control of the company. And as such, issues regarding judgment fragility and perhaps base fragility, because a change in membership will result in a change of the base, remain a problem for Professor Lackey's account. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a rich set of comments, and there's so much to engage with. So I will just try to get through as much as I can. I think I have 10 minutes. Is that correct? 10 minutes? Yes. Okay, so I'll just try to work my way backwards, just because that's what's like the freshest on my mind. So the point about how there's a voluntariness because of the selection of members, I think that that's right. I mean, and I kind of own that in the book at some point. I can't remember which chapter, but I definitely say that whenever you have sort of like an anchoring of individual members, you can always like, kind of like fire members, kill members. You can, kind of always change the makeup of the group and manipulate the kind of the states by virtue of that change. But I actually think that this is true. First of all, I think this is true for all accounts, because you could always kind of fire several members who just did not engage in the joint acceptance, and then just hire people who engage in the joint acceptance. So I think that any sort of intervention that comes about through actually like just fundamentally changing the makeup of the members is something that everybody, I mean, I think this is just a fact about groups too. If Northwestern kind of fires everybody who is currently a member of Northwestern and then rehires, Northwestern will become a very different institution. And so I think that I think that first of all, like, radically changing the membership of, or just even changing the membership of groups does change groups. And I think it would naturally follow that it would therefore change group states. And I think that this is something that is true, like I said, for all, just about every view. I mean, list and petit, this would be true. Joint acceptance accounts, this would be true, because maybe they wouldn't get the joint acceptance and so on. So I don't regard that as like a unique issue that my account faces. So the common knowledge, point that you raise, I mean, I'm really sympathetic with that concern, and, kind of gave it a fair bit of thought when I was thinking through these kinds of issues. So one of the concerns that I have is intentional. So I kind of came into this literature worried about corporations deliberately compartmentalizing information to deliberately cultivate secrecy. And corporations do this, right? I mean, they do this so that, kind of you have access to only some information, you have access to only some information, and like setting it up so that there are, kind of non-disclosure, agreements, and that the information is intentionally and deliberately compartmentalized and kept secret. And I'm concerned that those sorts of cases then lead to versions of the illegitimate manipulation of evidence problems that I'm just generally concerned about. Because then when we kind of keep information secret or keep information compartmentalized, we can manipulate the mental states, the epistemic states, and thereby the responsibility of the groups. So I think about cases where, like Margaret Gilbert's, case of where there's no common knowledge. And I think about the company being subpoenaed, and I mean, and individual members kind of being kind of forced to testify. And, did you know emphysema was unsafe? I did. I didn't want to say anything. I was kind of told to not say anything. I never talked to anyone about this. This was sort of like a tacit company rule. Nobody talks about this. And then they subpoena the next person and subpoena the next person and subpoena the next person. My intuitions are that in such a case, we would attribute group knowledge. So there's like two different kind of responses here. I mean, granted, I'm not expecting to convince everyone, right? I mean, like, this is philosophy. So, I mean, I get it that some people are going to really feel the pull of that common knowledge condition. And I respect that, and I think that some of these are choice points we make theoretically. But, kind of the two pulls, just to kind of like give an idea of why I landed where I did, the two pulls I have is like, almost immediately when I started thinking about this, I was powerfully aware of these deliberate compartmentalization cases, almost immediate legal cases, like cases that actually like are in US law like this, and was very concerned about that. So manipulating evidence and manipulating access to evidence is something that's on the forefront of my mind when I think about collective entities. And so that was really a driving force here. And then that combined with my kind of sense that if we were to kind of subpoena, like I said, like every member of Northwestern to ask if they knew something that none of us talked about, I do think that there is some intuitive pull to saying that like Northwestern knew, they were instructed to not talk about it, but like Northwestern knew. I think there's at least a sense in which we might be inclined to say something like that. I really like your point about the epiphenomenal worry here, I mean, like, and this kind of like, it's a bit of a dagger to the heart, because like, I definitely start the book with like, we want to be able to hold groups responsible, like agency's really important. We want to be able to assess their actions. And so I definitely want an account that appropriately does this. I guess I'm inclined to kind of go for the kind of response that Gilbert rejects, right? That we see this at the individual level, where there are kind of causally inert beliefs, and they're causally inert for various reasons, but they're also probably not completely causally inert. And so I can imagine that like if every single member of Philip Morris believes that smoking causes emphysema, I would be surprised if like in the company interactions that wasn't coming out in somewhere, so, like some ways. I just think that they might not be talking about it. They might not be putting it in their brochures. But I mean, if every single member actually believes this, I suspect that they would be kind of making certain kinds of choices. Like, here's one, right? Like as a group, like kind of, let's like kind of like have smoking, kind of parties every Wednesday, right? I mean, and suppose that we don't know anything about cancer or anything. Like emphysema is the first health problem that they know about, but no one's talking about it. It's not common knowledge. They might all be like, why don't we do something else, right? And I think that they might not kind of openly talk about it, but I suspect that even as a group, they wouldn't have smoking parties on Friday afternoon if they knew that it was like a very serious, there was a very clear connection between smoking and emphysema. So I actually think that, there's causal inertia and there's causal inertia. Do you know what I mean? And I think that in these sorts of cases, it probably would be like fairly difficult to identify some of the causal effects, and they might be kind of subtler. But I myself am inclined to think that they would emerge in some contexts. I think that, like I said, I think that we see this in people's behavior. I mean, I think that like racist beliefs come to mind. I think that most people would absolutely believe and like espouse and like kind of fight and be in Black Lives Matters protests and say, I'm not racist, right? But probably in various contexts, they probably wouldn't realize, you know what I mean? That like they just have these kind of biases, right? And prejudices that are operative in ways that kind of almost even in spite of themselves. And so I think that something similar might happen with respect to groups. And again, I guess one other thing is that like, while I think that this framework, why I was hoping that this framework would provide a foundation for thinking about how to hold groups responsible, I'm not suggesting that that's going to be an easy thing, right? When we think about deliberate compartmentalization cases, we think about deliberate secrecy, we think about the changes in makeup of, I mean, with an individual agent, I'm not like eliminating all my mental states and then getting a whole new group every so often, but that can happen with groups. And that's like a change in the metaphysics of the group, a change in the nature of the group. All of these things are going to have to be factored in. And I'm not suggesting that like I have the answer to all of that in this book. So I think that moving from the epistemology of groups to how all of this is going to kind of play out in terms of accountability is going to require more steps. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. So as our second critic, we have Adam Carter. Adam, please, welcome.
Right, I'm gonna try to keep these pretty short, around 10 minutes. First off, I really loved this book and I couldn't decide what to focus on. So I decided for a short commentary, I would focus on just a few things that I could kind of get into some of the details about. But overall, on the whole, obviously, this is an amazing and rich book, and and it's going to keep me thinking for a long time. Some of these comments, I don't know if they're really so much devastating objections or anything to Jennifer, but more just like questions for how she might clarify her account on a few small points. So the two things I want to focus on are in chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 2, I want to talk about the group epistemic agent account of justified group belief. And in chapter 3, I'm going to talk about collective knowledge. So I'll start with the group epistemic agent account of justified group belief, right? So we've got two main conditions here. And the first one is the one I want to talk about first, right? A significant percentage of the operative members of G justifiably believe that P and are such that the bases of their justified beliefs that P yield a belief set that is coherent. Okay, I've got a question about coherence. Now, Jennifer does have a sort of an ecumenical view of what she means by coherence in the first clause. And I think that's promising and that's good. What she says in this passage in clarifying coherence, right, is that one option is to understand coherence in terms of evidential support. Alternatively, right, coherence can be understood in terms of accuracy, dominance, avoidance, in the sense that for a coherent set of beliefs, there is no rival set of beliefs that is never worse and sometimes better than it with respect to overall accuracy. That aside, Jennifer is taking an ecumenical stance. So this is a devil's advocate point, and here's how it goes. It's even so. I wonder if we might have an issue with cases like this. So let's take the bird watching committee. So suppose that there's a committee that's formed to investigate whether there are pileated woodpeckers in a certain forest. And the committee determines that there are. Suppose their beliefs are largely non-inferential, right? They're formed by trusting perceptual faculties rather than inferring from evidence. And so here's the question. So how should we assess coherence in this case? Even on the kind of ecumenical proposal that Jennifer gives us, right? Because it's relevant to satisfying, right, clause 1 in the view. And the difficulty here seems to be that you get coherence or incoherence, right, from bases that are beliefs, right, such that they stand in logical relations to each other. And in birdwatching committee, it looks like the individual justification is non-inferential. These types of logical relations seem to be lacking because the bases seem to be just sort of the kind of bases we have in non-inferential cases. So that's just one question for clarification. A second question has to do with clause 2 of the account. And I've put in blue the bit that is relevant. So clause 2 again says, full disclosure of the evidence relevant to the proposition that P, accompanied by rational deliberation that the evidence among the members of G, in accordance with their individual and group normative requirements, would not result in further evidence that when added to their beliefs yields a total set that fails to make sufficiently probable that P. Okay, so my worry is that this might be too strong. So the thought is that clause 2 might be too strong. I'm not sure that it is. This is just an example just to sort of press the account a little bit. So here's the worry. Why might this be potentially too strong? So the rationale kind of has two parts to it. The first is that groups that deliberate through full disclosure and the pooling of evidence and communication with each other, these groups are more likely to polarize. And so we have some evidence from social psychology. One nice book on this is by Cass Sunstein that suggests that just the bare fact of sharing evidence with each other makes us more likely to succumb to certain kinds of psychological and social pressures to form sort of more extreme positions than one that we've already leaned towards. Some of you probably already know a lot about this from seeing cases of group polarization discussed in the media. The point here is just that groups that actually deliberate when they're fully disclosing their evidence are more likely to polarize than otherwise. Then the second idea, which puts a little bit pressure on the strength of clause 2 in Jennifer's formulation, is that the more that a group's polarized, it seems like the less likely the total belief set is going to make probable one position rather than the alternative. Now, here's a case to try to make this idea more concrete. So I looked up pictures of school boards fighting, and this is the only one that I could find that looks like they're fighting. So here's a polarized school board. So suppose we have a school board, there's 10 people, to make it simple, in the school board, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. And suppose they meet to decide something kind of mundane, like whether school uniforms are on the whole beneficial for students at the school. And now let's suppose that if they pooled their individual evidence without deliberating with each other, without talking to each other, the evidence would stand in favor of uniforms, I don't know, something like 0.7 or 0.8. However, suppose that with the deep political animosity between the group members, suppose that this makes it such that if they actually fully disclose their evidence through deliberation, then they're going to succumb to psychological and social pressures to polarize, along with their in-group political members, converging closer to 0.5, such that the proposition isn't going to really be so obviously made more probable than not. Now here's the worry more generally for the strength of clause 2 in the account. So it looks like what goes for this group, of course, you might just say, well, this group just isn't justified, right? They've polarized, they're not justified. But the worry is that what goes for this group might go for many groups, given the prevalence of polarization tendencies, which makes it look like clause 2 in the account might often remain unmet. And I'm going to conclude this point by suggesting a potential way to get around this problem, but it might not be one that Jennifer wants to accept. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking through it. So here's a potential suggestion for amending the clause to deal with issues, polarization style worries. So, right, note that clause 2 in the formulation is a counterfactual claim, right? It's satisfied if full disclosure would have, or actually would not have, right, a particular effect. But whether or not it does actually have this effect is sensitive to what we hold fixed under full disclosure, whether we're holding fixed full disclosure plus deliberation among members or not. If we hold fixed that it is accompanied by rational deliberation in accordance with normative requirements in a way that excludes the possibility of polarization, like we just had in the case of the school board, well, then the problem is avoided. But then a potential cost to idealizing clause 2 in this way is that maybe this kind of move is an idealization that, in light of the widespread prevalence of polarization in actual group deliberation, it might seem to remove the clause an awful long way from how groups actually behave in practice. That might be considered a worry. I'm not sure. So this is how I sort of thought through the dialectic on that, and I'll leave that at that. So that's my discussion of Jennifer's account of the group epistemic agent account of justified belief from chapter 2. I want to conclude with a kind of speculative point about what is said about group knowledge in chapter 3. First, I have to say I'm a big fan of the discussion there about defeat and the sort of critique that we have against socially extended knowledge accounts like Alexander Bird's. I think that's a really interesting defeat line. And I'm also sympathetic with a lot of the arguments in this chapter. Here's one question that I'm just not sure how we should think about, whether or not it's a problem for the type of view that Jennifer defends. So here's why I'm thinking this. So in that chapter, she deals with socially extended knowledge cases, and she deals with collective knowledge cases, such as some of the legal cases that are discussed, and points to how principles of action make these types of accounts problematic in such a way that her view isn't imperiled by the fact that we have to countenance knowledge in these cases. Here's the kind of case that I wonder what she would want to say about. And I don't know what I really think about it, but it's always sort of bothered me. These are cases of transactive memory systems that involve just 2 people. And they have a special case because the transactive memory system involves a kind of feedback loop of recall. So these cases were introduced into literature by Daniel Wegner in the 80s. And this is like a variation of this case that is kind of going around in some discussions of distributed cognition. So imagine a couple, and I guess this kind of happens relatively often, probably. Imagine a couple is trying to remember the restaurant that they visited on vacation, and they can't remember what it is. And so they have one of these sort of chats where they kind of bounce back and forth until they both coalesce on the answer where they didn't have it before. Neither of them remembered the name of the crab shack before they started chatting. But the chat goes like this. Oh, right. Well, let's see. Wasn't that by a river or something? And then B says, no, it was by a lake. And A says, oh, of course, I remember. In that restaurant, it served fish. And B says, that's right. And there was a jukebox playing. Oh, yeah, A says, in the corner. And B says, oh, right. And in that corner, there was a name on a big sign. Oh, and then A says, right, it's the crab shack. So something like that, where after sort of a memory style tennis match of back and forth, so we finally get to the answer that it's the crab shack. So here's a question, more so than an objection. So prior to this discussion, prior to the tennis balling feedback loop back and forth, are A and B merely in a position to know? Or might they be in a stronger position? Might they also have what we might call dispositional knowledge prior to this sort of recollective process? Much like an individual, right, is going to have individual level dispositional knowledge of a proposition, provided that they've previously endorsed that proposition and P is available by some mechanism to recall. Because it looks like, right, P seems to be available to this transactive memory system for recall by a certain kind of mechanism for recall. So I wondered whether or not perhaps this type of a group, given the strange features of this transactive memory system, that there's a feedback loop in play, might we want to say that they actually have dispositional knowledge rather than merely are in a position to know? So I don't know. I'm not saying that we should say this. I'm just wondering what Jennifer might say about that. So that's my question on collective knowledge. And I'm going to leave those comments there. And in general, just thank Jennifer for an amazing book. I loved a lot of it, and I just tried to focus on a couple things to chat about here. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Adam. It's just like really a privilege to have you and Deb and Federico commenting on the book. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And you kind of you're all hitting on parts of the book that when you write a book, we've all done this. You just feel like the pull of various things. So I'm going to start with the one that I feel like the pull, like there was like a lingering sense of worry. But I'll tell you, kind of try to contextualize what led me to the place. So that's condition 2 on the account. And you're worried that it's too strong, which like I share the worry in some respects. So broadly speaking, let me just take a step back from like the details of like what I say in that condition and tell you what like in my head I'm trying to capture in that condition. So what I'm really trying to capture is what like I was thinking a lot about the reasonable person standard in the law. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is idealize, and you really hit this when you talked about polarization too, right? Because in general in my work, like in epistemology and as a philosopher, I want to appropriately idealize, because obviously we're engaged in normative inquiry and we're trying to ask questions about what we ought to do as rational agents and as just agents in the world and as moral agents. But I also don't want to do such ideal work that that there's just no connection to our actual practices as individuals. So, right, I mean, it's like, like it might be like really, really easy to come up with like, kind of what should our norms be for everything? Well, believe what's true and do what's good. And like, we're done, right? I mean, like, let's just go home, I mean, that would be really, really simple. But like part of what makes those easy answers just believe what's true. And is that like we're complicated as cognitive agents, right? And so we need to there's a lot more that needs to go into talking about norms, because norms also need to take into account the agents that the norms ought to be guiding. And so condition 2 was really trying to get at this place where, and I was like in my head thinking about the reasonable person standard in the law, because obviously it's the law and it's telling jurors like actually what they should do, you know, kind of when they're applying the reasonable person standard, right? So when we're thinking about, you know, whether this person's reaction was appropriate and the jury is instructed to apply a reasonable person standard, you know, we're asking like just, and you know, any Americans, like, look, you should be able to ask, like, we're a reasonable person in this situation to respond. Is this an appropriate response? And so really what I'm trying to get at there is that if there were to take place this deliberation among reasonable people, right? What would it result from that deliberation? That's really what that condition's trying to get at. I could have just used language of reasonable person, but I was trying to get at it in a more direct epistemological way. Now, when you bring up something like polarization, like this is where like the rubber hits the road. I don't really know what to say, because in one sense, I want to say reasonable persons wouldn't polarize. And in another sense, I want to say, well, that's just what happens when people get together in a room. So I just don't really know where to come down on the group polarization point. And I really don't know what to say. If it is as widespread as some people suggest it is, where it falls on that side. But I kind of want to just kind of like say that worries about condition 2 being too strong, as stated, kind of lingered for me. And at times I wondered whether I should just swap out like just some language about like some reasonable person language, rather than trying to like kind of really get at what I say, you know, kind of get at that in a more specific way in what I say in the book. So that wasn't really an answer. It was more like, given this broad picture of where I'm coming from, I think the group polarization might just end up kind of falling at like being on the other side if we don't think this is what reasonable persons would be doing when they're engaging in collective deliberation. But if human beings are such that that's just what they do, like that's just how they are, then it's a little bit trickier for me to figure out what side it falls on. I'm comfortable with your last comment in terms of countenancing dispositional knowledge. I don't know if I would dispositional group knowledge, and that may be being different from being in a position to know. So I deal with a lot of so-called cases of social knowing in the literature by saying they're not actually cases of social knowing, they're cases of being in a position to know. But I'm also happy with adding to that framework there being group dispositional knowledge. I don't have an account of like, I don't, you know, I mean, like, you know, maybe you should, you know, write that next paper. I mean, I don't have an account of what dispositional knowledge is, but I'm theoretically happy to countenance it. And maybe the exchange you gave between the couple is an example of that. So I'm on board with that. And then the case of the visual case with the pileated woodpecker, what would you say if I just said that the case that the conflicting basis standard is just sort of satisfied trivially in such a case where there aren't inferential bases, do you know what I mean, from which they're inferring?
So I thought about that, and here was one possible way of going that way. What if you had just like a bunch of drunk people bird watching, and all of their bases are drunk perception, and then it would be that seem like we don't want to get it to where they all trivially satisfy the justified basis condition, right?
Yeah. So, but then they might trivially satisfy the non-conflicting basis condition, but then the individual members might not be justified if their visual perception through drunk.
Right. Never mind. That's right.
So I'm just wondering whether trivial satisfaction of the non-conflicting basis clause could just come about with the visual cases.
That might be right.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks so much again. Just really, you know, just, like I said, just like really, really happy to be thinking through these issues with all three of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carter. And now we have as our third critic, Federico Penelas. Please, Federico, welcome.
Thank you, Felipe. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to participate in this meeting. I'm very grateful to the organizers, to Concept, to the University of Bahia, especially to Valdomiro Silva, who suggested my name to be part of this exchange of ideas. It's a special joy to meet again, to see again Jennifer after 9 years of seeing us at that Northwestern meeting on group epistemology that she organized. 1 year before that meeting, that is 10 years ago, the Epistemology Group of the Argentine Society of Philosophical Analysis that I then direct together with Eleonora Cresto and Florencia Rimoldi, invite Jennifer to Buenos Aires to present and discuss very early drafts of some of the chapters of this book. It fills me with joy 10 years later to be here sharing with her this discussion about her ideas, finally consolidated in this, for me, extraordinary book. My intervention today will be only in the form of sub-questions. I will ask Jennifer for some clarifications regarding the final chapters of the book. But before that, I would like to ask Jennifer a very general metaphilosophical question. At the beginning of the book, in the thematization around the group belief, Jennifer draws attention to the fact that there has not been a thematization of replies in bibliography. She points out the failure by the different positions on group belief when characterizing the obvious fact that we attribute lies to groups. That failure is the motivation for a new characterization of the phenomenon of group belief. There is no adequate group belief theory if it cannot lead to characterizing group as capable of lying. Jennifer's idea, and what I believe is the most important motivation for the book, is that rejecting the possibility of group liars involves a dangerous ethical, legal, political deficit. That is, considerations about the practical need for having adequate conceptual tools lead the implementation of a theoretical review of the nature of group beliefs. Thus, Lackey's proposal is that focusing on the dark side, that is, on lies, requires a radical revision of a good part of the consideration typical of group epistemology. There is in this moment, I believe, methodological family resemblance with Miranda Frick's proposal to focus on the dark side, in her case on testimonial injustice, and from there to think about the testimonial justice and about the nature of testimony itself. It's a movement that one can also find in the idea of justice by Amartya Sen, when he sets out to offer a theory of justice that takes as a starting point asking questions about how to remove injustice instead of offering answers to questions about the nature of perfect justice. So the first question then is whether Jennifer recognized this methodological family resemblance, whether she believes that she's part of a metaphilosophical project that claims a dark side conceptual heuristic, and whether she himself believes that that project is essential to his approach to social epistemology. During Jennifer's visit to Buenos Aires, I remember that my participation as a commentator on her drafts was focused on her approach to group testimony. In her draft, Jennifer developed a deflationary account of group testimony, according to which a group's testimony is reducible to that of one or more individuals, to not necessarily those who are members of the group in question. So her position was original because it was a non-summative reductionism. 10 years later, I reread my comment and I find myself saying the following. I think that non-summative aspect of Jennifer's reductionism needs to pay more attention to the role of spokespersons. That's what I wrote them. It gives me a great theoretical satisfaction that the doubts that I might have then have been solidly addressed by Jennifer in her 2018 papers and in the final chapters of the book that we are discussing today. These chapters are, in my opinion, the heart of the book, where Jennifer performs a series of masterful theoretical operations. Her inflationism of the linguistic actions of group assertion, lie, and bullshit, together with her conception of spokespersons as participants with a certain degree of autonomy of an authority-based group assertion institution, are a substantial contribution to the history of group epistemology. What is important, however, about the originality and audacity of Jennifer's thesis is once again that they set out to shed light on our needs in holding powerful groups accountable for their persistence in deceptive practices. Beyond my enthusiasm for those final two chapters, I will allow myself to ask Jennifer some clarifying questions, all of them centered on the figure of the spokesperson. There are 4 questions, Jennifer. 1, Jennifer is emphatic in dismissing the idea that a spokesperson, when speaking on behalf of a group, make assertions. Spokespersons don't assert. Groups represented by them are which make assertions. However, it's not clear to me what is the nature of the act of communication carried out by a spokesperson. In Jennifer's characterization of the phenomenon of individual testimony, the focus is on acts of communication so as to allow for assertions that don't involve statements, as nods, pointing, and other gestures. Thus, the appeal to the idea of act of communication doesn't seem to be introduced to describe cases of testimony that don't involve assertions, but of cases of testimony that involve assertions conveyed by acts of communication that don't involve statements. But in the case of spokespersons, the point that Jennifer is interested in making it seems to be another. The case that interests Jennifer is not that of spokespersons making gestures, but acts of communication that involve statements that are not assertions. There is, for me, a slippage there that I think requires further clarification. What is the nature of these statements? Are they pseudo-statements, like those attributable to an actor representing a character in a play? It doesn't appear to be the case. What speak act is involved in such statements that don't qualify as assertions? That's my first question. 2, one possibility to characterize the speech act involved in the statements of a spokesperson could be to take them as genuine assertions, but whose content always involves the implicit, tacit allusion to the group. So when the spokesperson makes the statement, tobacco doesn't cause cancer, what he's really or she's really doing is asserting Philip Morris believes that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. Or better, and to avoid that all the responsibility falls on the spokesperson, Philip Morris has authorized me to report that Philip Morris believes that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. My second question is why Jennifer dismisses that possibility. 3, one of the most interesting contributions of Jennifer's proposal is to point out that spokespersons have autonomy, and that autonomy doesn't make groups non-responsible. The defense of this idea is supported by the case of the autonomous spokespersons. The case allows her, in turn, to give rise to a possible characterization of the idea of group bullshit. However, Jennifer also points out that the autonomy of the spokespersons reinforces the rejection of transmission beyond testimony. She considers a modified version of autonomous spokesperson. She says, suppose that it's true that smoking doesn't cause disease X, some disease, and the public comes to learn this on the basis of Philip Morris' spokesperson stating that this is so. In such a case, the public knows that smoking doesn't cause disease X on the basis of Philip Morris' testimony, but there is no sense whatsoever in which Philip Morris knows that smoking doesn't cause disease X, as Philip Morris doesn't even have the concept of disease X. So, Jennifer says, even if the transmission view is true of individual testimony, it cannot apply to at the level of groups. But it's not clear to me why this second case would not also be a group bullshit case. The fact that the proposition is true doesn't seem to make a difference. In what sense does the public learn from the words of the spokespersons? In what sense does the public know the proposition in question? Jennifer should point out either that it's not a case of bullshit and the public acquires knowledge, or that it's a case of bullshit and consequently the public acquires doesn't acquire knowledge, or that is possible to know from cases of bullshit. My question is, which of those alternatives you find acceptable? Finally, let's consider the following case. Autonomous spokesperson 3. Philip Morris, a spokesperson, is asked about the link between tobacco and a disease X that seems totally implausible that it can be caused by smoking. The spokesperson is authorized by Philip Morris to disregard any link between tobacco and health problems. Philip Morris never considered disease X, never addressed the question of the possible link between it and tobacco, neglect surely explained precisely by that implausibility. The spokesperson responds that there is no link between tobacco and X. My last question is, would Jennifer consider autonomous spokesperson 3 as a case of group bullshit as well? That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Please, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Federico. Yes, reminding me that I tried out some of these thoughts and views, 10 years ago in Buenos Aires, both, made me so nostalgic for our time there, but also reminded me how long it took me to finish this project. So thank you. And the input and feedback I got from you and your colleagues at that time, you can probably see it all over the book. So thank you so much. And thank you for these fantastic comments today. So there's a lot to think through, and I'll try to work my way through I think some of the 4 questions that you asked. So I'll start with the question about bullshit and transmission. So I do think that some of the I think that that's a really interesting proposal that you're making, that some of these cases where I'm asking us to imagine the spokesperson exercising some autonomy in what they say, right? And, like really emphasizing that spokespersons aren't just parrots. And when we hire a spokesperson, we expect them to answer things on their feet. But that some of these cases might end up looking like bullshit, right? I mean, especially if the spokesperson is just sort of like, just agreeing to things on the spot, and they don't have, it just seems like they're just kind of, there's no really regard for the truth or for the truth value of the claim at all. So yeah, I'm okay with maybe calling some of those bullshit. I mean, whether or not I'd say all of them are, I mean, I think that some of it would just have to depend on spelling out the details a little bit more. But in general, like I think, so do I think that an audience could get knowledge from bullshit in general? I do think that there might be some cases. I certainly think that the groups can get knowledge from lies. I mean, I think that it's, you know, kind of, so some, like, let's just start with like kind of my creationist teacher example, right? That like, I mean, I gave like back in my dissertation, right? You know, like a devout creationist, but teaches about evolutionary theory. Some people have called that a lie. I myself don't, because she doesn't have the intention to deceive. But if you want to call that a lie, then here's like kind of knowledge acquired through lying. Another example might be, you know, someone who's just a really reliable liar. And so kind of like but like kind of really also massively confused in terms of their beliefs. We might still be able to get knowledge from them because their testimony is reliable, even though they're dogmastic, their belief states are not. I think these are pretty fanciful cases. I don't think we have a whole lot of them. But in general, I'm inclined to think that we could get knowledge from lying. Bullshitting is harder because there's just such an utter disregard, right? There's just like with lying, you can imagine someone sort of like being reliably connected up with the truth, with the falsity, but then reliably connected up with the truth and their testimony. I mean, maybe this is really what happens. I mean, well, I don't know. Anyway, I mean, there are maybe some like kind of groups out there where we might actually accurately describe them. Bullshitting, given the utter disregard of the disregard for the truth, I think it's harder to imagine those kinds of cases where there's this kind of reliable connection. And so then therefore their testimony ends up being like true in all nearby worlds, you know, so that there's some sort of like reliability there or sensitivity or safety or something like that, so that it's not just like accidentally connected up with the truth. I think it's harder to imagine those kinds of cases. And for that reason, it might be actually harder to get knowledge from bullshit. Maybe it's hard even to imagine a case. I'm not sure I would just rule it out like immediately, but I do want to grant and kind of concede that I think it's harder to imagine those sorts of cases. So in the cases of autonomous spokesperson that start to resemble bullshitting, I think I probably would be inclined at this point to say that knowledge is not being, that those aren't cases of knowledge transmission. That the relevant conditions aren't satisfied, but whether there are any cases at all, I don't know. I mean, I just would have to, I'd have to think a little bit more about that. And I think that's a really good question. To be honest with you, Federico, I haven't really given a whole lot of thought to like pulling apart lying and bullshitting in these sorts of ways. And I think there's like really interesting kind of theoretical work that could happen there, because I mean, in the same way that Frankfurt says there's a way in which bullshitting is more pernicious from an epistemic point of view, maybe because it is sort of more pernicious, it's more likely to have these sorts of problems where there's no nearby worlds in which you could get knowledge from them. The part about like spokespersons, I mean, I think you're hitting upon like a really good question, and I don't really have it worked out. I mean, I sort of want to say like very weaselly, like with spokespersons, they're engaging in acts of communication, but they're not flat out assertions, just something like that. But I think that once we start talking about acts of communication, there's going to be some sort of normative assessment there. So I do think that the speech acts of spokespersons are interesting and have their own normative assessment, because for generally speaking, for acts of communication, we do think that there are like broad, like epistemic norms governing them, right? Something like sincerity or knowledge. I actually don't think knowledge is the case, but like I'm just throwing out the standard examples: sincerity, knowledge, reasonableness, whatever you might think. But with spokespersons, it's really weird because they're not governed by those traditional epistemic standards. Like I say this all the time: my chair better not go to the dean's office and try to be sincere. That's not what his purpose is when he's speaking on behalf of the department. He better talk about what the view is of the department, right? Sincerity is not what he's aiming for. So I think that there just might be like a different kind of like normative assessment of spokespersons. I mean, I think you're pointing out a weakness that I don't really kind of say what those are. Broadly, I'd say acts of communication, but they'd be really weird ones because you're not communicating on behalf of yourself. And so because of that, the normative standards are just going to be pretty different. And I loved the beginning when you said like, you know, I kind of like what brought me to this project is like the epistemological dark side. And I haven't really thought about it in that sort of way, but you're right that like really got me hooked almost from the very beginning was thinking about like group lies. And that kind of frames the whole project. Like I came to believe that there are genuine group beliefs via group lies, and I end the book with an account of group lies. And so I really like that sort of framing it in that sort of way. So thank you. Thank you so much for those comments.
Thank you everyone for participating. And of course, special thanks to Jennifer for giving us the opportunity to discuss her book. It was a great session. Lots of inspiring thoughts for sure. And again, if you would like to buy the book, The Epistemology of Groups, you can check the information here at the description. So our Philosopher Meets Critics will have a break during the summer, and we will come back in September with Adam Carter discussing his new book, Autonomous Knowledge. And again, if you'd like to stay up to date with future installments of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events organized by Concept, you can visit us at concept-phil.de, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Figments of the Brain. With that said, once again, thank you everybody for participation, and thanks for watching. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.